Ako bih vas pitao čemu je bila propoved za Mother's Day,
If I asked you, what was the topic of the sermon for Mother's Day?
to je tako bilo skoro, ne možete zaboraviti.
It was so recent, you can't have forgotten already.
Da pitamo majke
Let's ask the mothers.
o Mojsijevoj majci, tako i Johavedi.
It was about Jochebed, Moses' mother.
I sećate se, mi smo rekli da je Johaveda uradila veliki posao.
And you remember that we said that Jochebed did a fantastic job.
I Mojsije ne bi bio to što je bio, eto da ona ga nije sakrila onu barku i pustila kroz Nil.
And you know that Moses would never have become who he was if she hadn't put him in that little basket and let him go down the Nile.
Ali hajde da se ne zadržimo puno samo na Mojsijevoj majci, hajde danas da pričamo malo više o Mojsiju.
But let's not stop at Moses' mother. Let's spend a little more time on Moses himself.
Znate, kad razmišljate o Mojsijevom životu,
When we think about the life of Moses,
imate 3 puta po 40.
there are 3 sections of 40.
Mojsije je bio 40 godina na dvoru.
Moses was in Egypt on the king's palace for about 40 years.
40 godina je vodio narod kroz pustinju.
He led the people of Israel for 40 years through the desert.
A onda je bio sandvič između, a to je 40 godina pustinje.
And in between that sandwich, he spent about 40 years by himself in the desert.
I znate, mi kad čitamo Bibliju, mi tako te cifre malo i brzo pročitamo.
And sometimes when we read the Bible, we just overlook these figures.
Ali zamislite 40 godina biti u pustinji.
But imagine spending 40 years in the desert.
U jednim skroz drugačijim uslovima nego dvor.
In completely different an environment than the palace.
Ajde da razmišljamo šta je to uticalo sve na njega da Mojsije postane tako dobar vođa.
Let's spend a little time to understand what are all these factors that influenced Moses to become such a good leader.
Ja bih želeo da razmišljamo kako da ja budem veran, šta mogu da naučim od Mojsija.
And I'd like us to think, what can we learn from Moses so that we could have that same faithfulness that he exhibited?
Ajde, mi smo prošli put završili sa 10. stihom 2. poglavlja.
Last time we finished with Exodus chapter 2, verse 10.
Ajde sada nastavljamo od 11. stiha.
Let's carry on today from verse 11.
11. stih: I kad Mojsije bijaše velik, iziđe ka braći svojoj i gledaše nevolju njihovu i vide da nekakav misirac bije čoveka Jevrejina između braće njegove.
So Exodus 2:11. Many years later, when Moses had grown up, he went out to visit his own people, the Hebrews, and he saw how hard they were forced to work. During his visit, he saw an Egyptian beating one of his fellow Hebrews.
Evo kad razmišljate, sad 40 godina je bio na dvoru.
So when you think about this, he had been on the palace for 40 years.
I posle ovih 40 godina, kaže tekst, on odluči da iziđe i da poseti svoju braću, svoj narod.
And after 40 years, he decides to go out and to go visit and mingle with his people.
I znate, ja razmišljam zašto je odlučio da poseti svoju braću kad mu je dobro tamo.
And so I was thinking, why did he bother to go visit his brethren when he was really well? He was good at the palace.
Evo kad razmišljate o životu, možete da zamislite jedan princ u Egiptu kako je živeo.
Just imagine how a prince in Egypt must have lived.
Ja sam prošli put spomenuo da je on bio zapovednik vojske.
I mentioned last time that he was the commander of the army.
Josif Flavije, istoričar, kaže da se on borio protiv Etiopije u to vreme.
And Josephus Flavius says that he fought at that time against the Ethiopian army.
Predvodio je vojsku i pobedili su.
He led the Egyptian army and they won.
Sad zamislite koliko je on bio poštovan.
So imagine how respected he must have been.
F.B. Meyer kaže, ovako izgledao njegov život u Egiptu.
F.B. Meyer says that this is how Moses' life in Egypt was like.
Ako bi izlazio na ulice, to bi bilo u Kneževskoj koči, usred povika, poklonite se. Ako bi plovio Nilom, to bi bilo u zlatnoj barci, uz zvuke raskošne muzike.
So F.B. Meyer writes, if he, Moses, walked through the streets, it would have been in a princely chariot amid cries of honor. If he sailed the Nile, it would have been in a golden barge with luxurious music.
Zašto neko ko tako dobro živi odlučuje, kaže ovdje tekst, da poseti svoju braću?
So why would somebody who has such a good life decide to go visit his poor brethren?
Zašto se seća uopšte svog porekla?
Why would he even think about his origins?
Znate, mogao je da kaže, ostaću ovde na dvoru, pa ću ja malo da pomognem svom narodu, ubedit ću ja faraona malo da popusti.
He could have said, well, I'll just stay here at the palace and I'll try to influence Pharaoh to maybe just give a little bit of slack to my people.
A znate šta je još Mojsije mogao da razmišlja? Pa jednoga dana ću možda postati faraon.
And he could have also been thinking, well, one day I'll become Pharaoh.
A zamislite to oslobođenje Božjeg naroda kad si ti faraon.
And imagine how you can then liberate your people when you're the Pharaoh.
Je li mogao da nađe opravdanje da ne ide ka svojoj braći, nego jednostavno da ostane u palati?
So he could have found all sorts of very valid reasons why not to go visit his people and just stick around at the palace.
E sad vidite, Mojsije, to je veličina Mojsije i tu možemo puno naučiti.
This is where we can see the grandeur of Moses and where we can really learn from him.
Jevrejima 11. poglavlje od 24 do 26.
In Hebrews 11:24 to 26,
Upravo nam govori zašto je odlučio da poseti braću.
it tells us exactly why Moses decided to go visit his brethren.
Kaže, vero Mojsije kad bi velik, ne htede da se naziva sin kćeri faraonove i volje stradati sa narodom Božjim, nego li imati zemaljsku sladost greha, državši sramotu Hristovu za veće bogatstvo od svega blaga misijskoga, jer gledaše na platu.
So Hebrews 11, verses 24 to 26. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God, rather than enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded this grace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward.
Neverovatan stih.
Incredible verse.
Mojsije kaže, celo bogatstvo Egipta ga ne zanima.
Moses says, all the riches of Egypt are nothing to him.
Kaže, bolje mu je stradati sa narodom Božjim nego ovo uživati.
He would rather suffer with the people of God than enjoy these riches.
Znate koliko je Egipat bio bogat?
Do you have a sense of how rich Egypt was at the time?
Najbogatija grobnica koja je pronađena je Tutankamonova.
The sarcophagus of Tutankhamun, who was discovered some time ago.
Mi se divimo zlatu koje smo pronašli.
We're just in awe of all the gold that was found there.
A znate zašto smo pronašli?
And do you know how we found it?
Jer pre niko nije stigao do opljačka.
Because nobody got to it to pillage it before we did.
A kažu da je ta grobnica imala mnogo manje zlata nego druge grobnice.
And it is said that that sarcophagus has actually had a lot less wealth and gold in it than others.
Toliko puno zlata.
A tremendous amount of gold.
Mojsija to ne zanima.
But Moses is not interested.
On misli o svom narodu
He thinks about his people.
i odlučuje da, kad je bio velik, posle 40 godina, da ode i da poseti svoj narod.
And he decides that even though he had this great position of honor, he decides then to go visit his people.
I onda ovaj tekst kaže, kad je posjetio svoj narod, video je njihovu nevolju,
And then when he visited his people and saw their suffering,
i onda kaže, i vide nekakav misirac bije čoveka Jevrejina između braće njegove.
and as we read in verse 11, it says during his visit, he saw an Egyptian beating one of his fellow Hebrews.
I kaže, obazrevši se tamo i vamo, kad vide da nema nikoga, ubi misirca i zakopa ga u pesak.
And verse 12 says, after looking in all directions to make sure no one was watching, Moses killed the Egyptian and hid the body in the sand.
Sad vidite, Mojsije posle 40 godina šta zna?
So what does Moses know after 40 years?
Zna da je on izbavitelj svog naroda.
He knows that he is the one that will bring salvation to his people.
Evo, po ovome događaju mi sad i ne znamo tačno šta je u njegovoj glavi,
We're not sure what was really going through his mind at this moment.
ali čitajte Dela 7. poglavlje 25. stih.
But read Acts of the Apostles, chapter 7, verse 25.
Kaže, mišljaše pak da braća njegova razumiju da Bog njegovom rukom njima spasenje dade, ali oni ne razumeše.
Acts 7:25 says, Moses thought that his own people would realize that God was using him to rescue them, but they did not.
Sad, Mojsije zna da je bio sačuvan u onoj maloj barci, da je čudesno dospeo na dvor i on zna da Bog ima misiju za njega.
Moses knows that it was miraculously that he was preserved in that little basket on the Nile and that he was now in this phenomenal Pharaoh's palace.
A da vam kažem, zašto ovo nije bio Božji način izbavljenja njegovog naroda?
But let me tell you why this was not going to be the way how God saves his people.
Vidite, Mojsije je bio vojskovođa.
Moses was a military man.
Kako će vojskovođa izbaviti svoj narod?
How is a commander going to save his people?
Pa uzet će mač.
He'll take the sword.
Ali to nije bio Božji način.
But that's not God's way.
Bog nije želeo da izbavi svoj narod ratom.
God did not want to save his people by force,
Bog nije želeo da izbavi svoj narod politikom.
not by politics.
Bog je želeo da on izbavi svoj narod.
God wanted it to be that it be him who saves and liberates his people.
Znate kako glasi prva zapovest?
Do you remember how the first commandment goes?
Nemaj drugih bogova. Zašto?
Do not have other gods. Why?
Jer sam te ja spasio iz Egipta.
Because I'm the one who liberated you from Egypt.
Ne Mojsije, ne mač, nego Bog.
Not Moses, not the sword, but God himself.
A zapazite tekst kada je Mojsije ubio ovog Misirca, šta je uradio?
And notice in the text, what did Moses do when he killed this Egyptian?
Kaže da je pogledao levo,
He looked
pogledao
left,
desno,
looked to his right,
video da nema nikoga,
he saw that there was nobody.
a gde nije pogledao?
But where did he not look?
Nije pogledao gore.
He did not look up.
Vidite, Boga nije pozvao da ovo uradi.
God did not call Moses to do this.
I ovdje govori o Mojsijevom karakteru koji je još uvijek bio drugačiji od onoga kako je trebao da bude.
And this speaks to Moses' character and how he wasn't yet the person that God was calling him to be.
I onda kaže ovdje tekst, šta je uradio? Zakopao ga je.
And so the text says, what did he do? He buried the Egyptian.
Pesak je jako dobar, ne morate puno da kopate.
Sand is easy to work with, you don't have to dig very hard.
A onda 13. stih kaže,
And then in verse 13 it says,
a sutradan iziđe opet i vidi da se dva Jevrejina svađahu. I reče onome koji činjaše hrivo, zašto biješ bližnjega svojega?
the next day when Moses went out to visit his people again, he saw two Hebrew men fighting. Why are you beating up your friend? Moses said to the one who had started the fight.
A on reče mu, ko je tebe postavio knezom i sudijom nad nama? Hoćeš li da me ubiješ kao što si ubio Misirca? Tada se Mojsije uplaši i reče, zaista se doznalo.
The man replied, who appointed you to be our prince and judge? Are you going to kill me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday? Then Moses was afraid, thinking, everyone knows what I did.
Znate ko je bio svedok ovog ubistva?
So do you know who was a witness of this murder?
Mojsije, Izraelac i Egipćani, ne može više da priča.
Moses, the Hebrew who was the victim here, and the Egyptian who can't speak anymore for himself.
Kako se tako brzo saznalo?
So how did the news spread so quickly?
Evo, probajte nekome odati neku tajnu.
Tell a secret to someone.
Evo, znate koliko dugo će to ostati tajna?
How long will that secret remain secret?
Znate, budimo jako oprezni kada delimo nešto intimno sa drugima.
We need to be very careful when we share something very personal with somebody else.
Mi ljudi ne možemo da ćutimo.
We people, we just can't keep our mouths shut.
Ja se sećam kad sam bio mali, ja sam jako voleo ove bajke.
I remember when I was young, I really liked these stories.
Mi kad odemo u prodavnicu, ja ne gledam igračke, nego one bajke.
When we go to the store, I don't look at toys, I look at the storybooks.
Ja sam imao sve te priče, čitave setove.
I had all these sets of books, of stories.
Nikad neću zaboraviti jednu priču.
And I'll never forget one of these
Evo
stories.
i deca su tu.
The kids are here too.
Muž je teo da testira ženu koliko može da čuva tajnu.
There was a husband who wanted to check how well his wife could
I
keep
pre
a
nego što
secret.
otišao na posao, pokazuje jedno jaje.
And so before he went to work, he showed her an egg.
I onda je rekao, kaže, ja sam sneo ovo jaje, ali nema nikome da kažeš.
And he said, I laid this egg, but don't tell anybody.
Kad je otišao na posao, ona kod komšinice,
And when he went to work, she went to the neighbor.
i onda komšinica kaže komšinici, muž je sneo jaje, ali nema nikome da kažeš.
And this woman told the neighbor, my husband laid this egg, but don't tell anybody.
A onda ona ode sledeći, isto kaže, nemoj da kažeš.
And then this neighbor goes to the other neighbor and says the same thing.
I tako je išlo.
And that's how it went.
Kad se on vratio u mesto,
And when the husband came back,
a celo mesto priča o tome,
the entire area knew the story.
ali više nije bilo jedno jaje,
But this time it wasn't no longer one egg.
nego on je već 1000 jaja sneo.
He had laid thousands of eggs.
Kad razmišljate o ovom događaju,
When you think about this story,
ovaj Izraelac koji je to podelio,
this Hebrew who had shared the event,
to je neverovatno išlo da je stiglo do faraona.
It spread so quickly that it had even reached Pharaoh.
Ali nije bio ubijen jedan čovek samo.
But it wasn't just one Egyptian who had been killed.
Kad je došlo do faraona,
By the time it got to Pharaoh,
znate kako je to zvučalo?
can you imagine how it sounded?
Da je Mojsije pokrenuo narod na pobunu protiv Egipta.
Moses has raised a revolution against Egypt.
Zato, kada razmišljate ovdje u sljedećem stihu,
And so when you think about the next verse here,
kaže, faraon kada je čuo za ovo, tražio je da pogubi Mojsija.
it says that when Pharaoh heard what happened, he wanted to kill Moses.
Ali, kaže, Mojsije pobeže od faraona i dođe u zemlju Madijansku i sede kod jednog studenca.
But Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in the land of Midian and sat down beside a well.
Znate, da budem iskren, meni je uvek bilo zašto ga hoće ubiti, pa ajde jednog čoveka, ali ipak je on princ.
So I was always thinking, okay, I mean, Moses shouldn't have killed one man, but he was a prince.
Ali ovo je tako zvučalo da je on izdao Egipat i on sprema robove da se pobune.
But this rumor had become just so huge that it sounded like Moses had raised an entire revolution against Egypt, and that's why Pharaoh wanted to kill him.
I Mojsije zna da će biti ubijen i on mora da pobegne.
Moses knows what's awaiting him, and he has no choice but to flee.
Sad, kada razmišljate o Mojsiju, kako je ovo bilo za njega strašno?
And so imagine how terrible it must have been for Moses.
Pazite, ne samo da osjeća mržnju faraona, koga je dobro poznavao,
Not only that he now has the hatred of Pharaoh, whom he knew very well,
nego je bio odbačen od sopstvenog naroda.
but he was rejected by his own people.
Oni njemu kažu, ko si ti da budeš knez nad nama?
They tell him, who are you to rule over us?
Sve se srušilo.
Everything collapsed.
Sve njegove nade u izbavljenju.
All his hopes of liberation.
Nema više egipatske raskoši. Raskoši, to luksuza.
No more luxury in Egypt.
I on mora da ode u pustinju.
He has no choice but to flee in the desert.
I evo ga sada u pustinji. Možda da ne čitamo ove sve stihove do kraja. Znate šta se desilo u pustinji?
So he's now in the desert. We're not going to read all the verses, but you remember what happens in the desert.
Došao je do studenca.
He came to this well.
Tu su došle 4 devojke.
4 young women were there.
Došle su sa ovcama.
They came with their family sheep.
Došlo je do konflikta sa pastirima.
There was a conflict with the other shepherds.
A onda Mojsije.
And then Moses steps
Sad
in.
vidite, Mojsije je vojskovođa.
And remember, Moses is a military commander.
Mojsije je treniran da se bori.
Moses has been trained to fight.
Šta mogu njemu ovi pastiri?
What can these shepherds do to him?
On ih je za čas odbranio.
He dealt with them in a moment.
Ali onda tekst kaže, ne samo da ih odbranio na studencu,
And not only did he protect these young women at the well,
nego je uzeo i kaže, napojio je njihove ovce.
but he even brought water out for their sheep.
I znate, kada razmišljate, ovo je moguće prvi put u svom životu da je Mojsije davao vodu ovcama.
This may be the very first time in Moses' life that he is giving water to sheep.
A znate zašto?
Why?
Zato što pastirstvo je bilo nečisto za Egipćane.
Because for Egyptians, the shepherds were unclean.
Sjećate se kad je Josif doveo Jakova u Egipat,
Do you remember when Joseph brought his father Jacob to Egypt?
a bio je jako mudar.
And he was very wise.
I kaže on faraonu, nemoj njih da stavljaš u Egipat, oni su pastiri, a to je nečisto, stavi ih van Egipta.
Moses tells Pharaoh, don't bring them into the heart of Egypt because they're shepherds, that's unclean. Put them in another area.
A Josif nije želeo da se oni suoče sa svim tim bogovima, sve što je u Egiptu.
When actually Joseph did not want his family to have to deal with all these gods that were in Egypt.
I tako da su oni dobili neko mesto van Egipta.
So they were given a remote area outside of the heart of Egypt.
Sasvim moguće, Mojsije prvi put daje vodu ovcama.
It's very likely the first time that Moses brings water out and gives the water to these sheep.
Sad vi znate da skratimo da je on tada otišao kod njih, dobio je ručak.
So just to make it short, he went and met the family of these young girls. They fed him.
Dobio je vremenom ruku od jedne od ćerki.
He received the hand of one of these girls over time.
Dobili su dete.
They had a child.
Sećate se ime deteta?
Do you remember the name of the child?
Mogli bismo reći stranac.
A foreigner.
I vidite kako se Mojsije osjeća.
That's how Moses feels.
Nije to njegov dom.
That's not his home.
Njegov dom je tamo, među njegovim narodom.
His home is back up there with his people.
I sada počinje 40 godina u pustinji.
And now 40 years in the desert begin.
Možete misliti šta je prolazilo kroz njegovu glavu.
You can just imagine what was going through his head.
Nema više misije, nema izbavljenja, on je ovdje običan pastir.
No more mission, no more liberation, he's just a shepherd here.
Hajde da nastavimo dalje.
Let's read on.
Kad se vratimo ovdje sada, ponovo na onaj tekst iz Jevrejima,
When we come back to the text in Hebrews,
zašto je Mojsije bio tako velik?
why was Moses so great?
Zašto je bio sposoban da taj veliki narod kasnije ipak izvede?
Why was he able later on to still ultimately liberate this great people?
Ja bih volio da izvučemo 4 tačke.
I'd like us to draw out 4 factors.
Šta treba mi da naučimo?
What we need to learn from this.
Pazite sad ovo, kaže, verom Mojsija, ajde vratimo se na onaj stih, kad bi veli, kaže, nehte da se nazove sin kćeri faraonove i volje stradati sa narodom Božjim nego li imati zemaljsku sladost greha. I državši sramotu Hristovu za veće bogatstvo od svega blaga misijskoga, jer gledaše na platu.
Let's read again Hebrews 11:24 to 26. By faith Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward.
Kad uzmete ovaj stih, šta je karakterisalo njegov identitet?
So what is the characteristic of Moses' identity based on this verse?
Znači, Mojsije se pitao ko sam ja.
Moses asked himself, who am I?
Šta je karakterisalo njegov identitet?
What are the characteristics of my identity?
Da li je ono što je okolina želela
Is it what the people around him were wishing,
ili ono što je Bog?
or what God was wishing?
Vidite, svi u Egiptu su želeli da on postane princ.
Everybody in Egypt wanted him to be a prince.
Veoma poštovan.
He was respected,
Ali kaže ovaj stih, njega to ne zanima, jer njegov identitet je u Bogu.
but this verse says that wasn't of interest to Moses because his identity was in God.
Znate, ja kad razmišljam o nama,
And when I think about us here,
šta karakteriše tvoj i moj identitet?
what characterizes your identity and mine?
Da li je ono što kažu moji vršnjaci?
Is it what my peers say about me?
Da li što kaže momak ili devojka?
Is it what a young man or young woman says?
Da li što kaže kolega na poslu?
Maybe a colleague at work?
Šta je naš identitet?
What is our identity?
Ono što Bog kaže.
What God says.
I Mojsije je znao da je njegov identitet.
And Moses knows that that's his identity.
Znate, ako hoćemo da uspemo u životu,
If we wish to be successful in life,
onda treba da znamo koji je naš identitet.
we need to know our identity.
Vidite, kaže, Mojsije je odbio da živi život laži, a mnogi ljudi žive život osobe koje nisu.
Moses refused to live a life of lies, but many people actually do that.
Mojsije ne želi da živi život laži.
Moses does not want to live a life of lies.
On zna identitet i on živi to.
He knows his identity and that's what he lives.
Rimljanima 12:2, onaj dobro poznati stih,
A very well-known text in Romans 12 verse 2.
Kaže, ne vladajte se prema ovome veku, nego se promenite obnovljenjem uma svojega.
It says, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind.
Šta kaže Pavle? U stvari, ne vladajte se, šta to znači?
What does Paul mean when he says, do not conform?
Kaže, nemojte da okolina vas formuliše,
It says, do not let your peers shape you.
nego znaj svoj identitet, a to je u Bogu.
Know your identity and that it is with God, in God.
Znate, mi se često plašimo tog kriticizma ili odbacivanja.
We're often afraid of that, of being criticized and rejected.
Znate, ako ja kažem moj identitet, možda ću biti odbačen.
If I tell people what my identity is, maybe they'll reject me.
Ali vidite, Mojsija to ne zanima.
But that's not a concern for Moses.
Zato je Bog mogao da radi sa njim.
And this is why God could use him.
Imali smo, hajde ovo da spomenemo, mala digresija na Andrewsu.
A small digression worth mentioning. At
Imali smo
Andrews,
jutarnje proučavanje.
during the study in the morning,
Lepo smo proučavali.
we had a great study.
I onda smo spomenuli kad Isus oprao noge učenicima.
And we mentioned when Jesus washed the feet of the disciples.
Znate koji je stih pre nego što je oprao noge?
Do you know what is the verse just before he washed their feet?
Kaže tekst da je Isus znao da je od Boga došao i ka Bogu ide.
The text says that Jesus knew that he came from God and that he is returning to God.
A onda se sagnuo i oprao noge.
And then he went down on his knees and washed their legs.
Šta to znači?
What does that mean?
Vidite, Isus je znao svoj identitet.
Jesus knew his identity.
Znao je ko je.
He knew who he was.
I on nema problema da opere noge učenicima.
And he has no problem to wash the disciples' feet.
Ako ne znamo naš identitet,
If we don't know our identity,
nikad nećemo moći uraditi velike stvari za Boga.
we'll never be able to do great things for God.
A ovo je prva stvar iz ovog stiha.
That's the first takeaway from this verse.
A druga stvar, šta je Mojsije naučio, kako je živeo?
What is the second takeaway? What did Moses learn about his life?
Ovde na engleskom jako lepo zvuči, mislim da ovde ima, ali kratkotrajni bol za duže zadovoljstvo.
This is a very nice expression in English. Short-term pain for long-term gain.
Jako lepo, čak se i rimuje u engleskom, jako interesantno.
I really like how this sounds in English. It's very interesting.
Vidite, Mojsije može da uživa.
Moses can enjoy life.
On se odlučio, kaže ovde stih, da strada. To je pain.
But he chooses instead to go through pain
Za mnogo duže zadovoljstvo.
for a much longer term satisfaction.
Izbavljenje Božjeg naroda i večni život.
The salvation of the people of God and eternal life.
Znate, ja kad razmišljam, evo sad 21. vek, svi smo mi na ovoj zemlji.
When I think about this, here we are, 21st century, we're all here.
Znate, mi volimo sada i odmah.
We like the here and now.
Ne želimo da čekamo.
We don't want to wait.
A vidite, mudrost života je imati kratki pain, bol za duže zadovoljstvo.
But wisdom says that we should want short-term pain for long-term gain.
Meni je ovdje fantastična slika sportiste.
I love the image of an athlete here.
Kad gledamo sportiste, onda gledamo uvek Jacoba.
When we think about athletes, I can't help but look at Jacob.
Znate, Jacob kad ima trke, on ne trči odmah na trku.
When there's a race to be run, Jacob doesn't just show up for the race.
Nego se prvo priprema.
He prepares, he practices, trains.
A priprema možda nekada nije tako prijatna.
And that training is not always enjoyable.
I onda vidite, mi kad pripremamo ručak, ali Jacob trči.
And you see, we're preparing food, but Jacob is running.
A vidite, to je taj long-term pain za zadovoljstvo, za nagradu. Short term.
That's the short-term pain, but for the satisfaction of victory.
Ja kad odem u džim, recimo,
When I go to the gym,
ja sam odlučio da radim trbušnjake.
I've decided to do abdominal workouts.
A trbušnjake, to je, mislim, najbolnije raditi.
Abs
Najbolnije.
abs are the most painful workout for me.
Evo, probajte, to je baš osjećate bol.
Try it and you'll feel actual pain.
Ali ja sam odlučio 60-70 svaki dan.
But I've decided to do 60-70 every day.
You
need to rest a little bit between those, right? One day on and
Ja
off.
pauziram do sutradan.
No wonder he has a lot of pain.
Da. Ali sad je sve bolje i bolje.
But it's getting better and better.
Ali ja hoću mišići da mi drže kičmu, da ima manje bolove i sve.
I want to build up my core, I want to have less pain in the back and so forth.
Ali to je short term pain za nešto bolje.
This is short-term pain for something better.
A tako i u životu.
And it's the same in life.
I Mojsije je to znao.
And Moses knew that.
I Mojsije je odlučio, neću živjeti još 40 godina u zadovoljstvu.
And Moses decides that he's not going to live another 40 years in the enjoyment of luxury,
A da izgubim večni život.
but to lose eternal life,
Da izgubim svoj identitet.
to lose my identity.
I on je odlučio da ode i da posjeti svoj narod.
And that's why he decides to go and visit his people.
Šta su tvoje vrednosti? Pa iste sad kako Mojsije kaže. Mojsije je gledao na platu.
What are your values? Look at what Moses says. Moses was looking ahead to his reward.
I vidite, plata koju on očekivao je okarakterisalo njegove vrednosti.
The reward that he was seeking was shaping his values.
I njegove vrednosti su bile drugačije od Egipćana.
And his values were clearly different from those of the Egyptians.
Evo da vas pitam, koje su vaše vrednosti?
Let me ask you, what are your values in life?
Evo, kad bi neko vas pitao i trebate odmah da kažete.
If somebody asked you and you need to answer on the spot,
Jel možete odmah da kažete koje su vaše vrednosti?
can you say immediately what are your values?
Znate, kažu, ako ne možemo ovako odmah da se setimo, onda nismo ni sigurni šta su vrednosti.
It's said that if we can't answer this question on the spot, it means that we're not even sure about what our values are.
Ja mislim da smo Mojsiju u ponoć probudili u Egiptu, on bi znao šta su njegove vrednosti.
I think that if you woke up Moses in the middle of the night and you asked him for his values, he could tell you right there and then.
Znate, danas imate, šta su vrednosti danas?
What are the values in the world we live in today?
Znate ona 3P?
You know the 3 Ps?
Čak u engleskom i na našem je posed, pozicija, popularnost.
Possession.
Possession.
Oh, possession. So possessions, position,
i popularnost.
and popularity.
Evo danas kažu, sva ova, kaže, ljudi uglavnom se kreću u ova 3.
And it said that basically people revolve around these 3 Ps.
Da vrednost je da steknem što više,
I want to acquire as much as possible.
vrednost je da postignem što više na zemlji,
I value achieving as much as possible on earth.
interesantno popularnost.
And very interesting, popularity.
Znate, popularnost nije samo za glumce i pevače.
Fame is not just for artists, singers, actors.
Kažu da mi radimo u životu da bi zadivili druge.
We work and we live through life to impress others.
To je vrednost danas.
That's the value today.
Pazite, Mojsije je sve ovo imao u Egiptu.
Moses had all of this in Egypt.
I position, imao je i posed veliki, imao je jako veliku popularnost. Klanjali su mu se.
Possessions, position, popularity. He was extremely popular. People would bow down to him as he walked.
Ali on imao skroz drugačije vrednosti.
But he had entirely different values.
I mi tu učimo od Mojsija, ako hoćemo da nas Bog iskoristi na ovoj zemlji, moramo imati drugačije vrednosti.
And this is something we need to learn from Moses. If we want God to be able to use it here on earth, we have to have the values of Moses.
I ajde zadnja stvar.
And last thing,
Sa ovim bismo završili.
and let's finish with this.
Ajde ponovimo šta je Mojsija znao, znao je ko je.
So let's go over this again. Moses knew who he was.
Znao je ovaj short term pain za long term
Gain.
gain.
That's second.
Šta je treće?
And what is third?
Znao je vrednosti.
He knew his values.
Egipat nije karakterisao njegove vrednosti, nego je on znao biblijske vrednosti da prati.
Egypt did not shape Moses' values. Moses built his values based on the Bible.
Sad uzmite ovu zadnju stvar, a to je priprema u pustinji.
And so look at this last item, and that is the preparation in the wilderness.
Ja sad opet kažem, mi to brzo pročitamo, 40 godina je bio u pustinji.
We tend to read over that very quickly, but it's 40 years.
40 godina je čuvao ovce.
He watched the sheep for 40 years.
Ali posle 40 godina pustinje bio je spreman.
But after 40 years in the wilderness, finally now he is ready.
Bio je spreman da izvede narod.
He was ready to bring God's people out.
Znate šta sam ja zapazio u Bibliji, verujem i vi?
And you know what I've noticed in the Bible, and I trust you have as well.
Da mnogi velikani su imali svoje pustinje.
Many great people had their wilderness experience.
Vrlo interesantno, sam David je bio pastir.
Interesting, David himself was a shepherd.
Pre nego što je bio veliki car.
Before he was a great king.
Naučio je šta znači čuvati ovce.
He learned what it's like to watch over sheep.
Znate koliko je Josif bio u zatvoru i rob pre nego što je postao premijer?
Do you know how long Joseph spent in jail before he became the prime minister of Egypt?
13 godina.
13 years.
I znate kad uzmete mi to pročitamo.
Again, we read very quickly over that.
Ali neko je 13 godina bio u patnji.
But somebody was suffering for 13 years.
A onda je bio spreman da postane premijer.
And then he was ready to be prime minister.
Manasija, gde se obratio?
Manasseh, where did he convert?
Najlošiji car.
The worst king ever.
Znate šta je njegova pustinja bila zatvor?
Do you know what his wilderness was?
Tad je počeo da razmišlja.
In captivity. That's when he started
Isus je
thinking.
bio u pustinji pre nego što je krenuo da vodi narod.
Jesus himself went in the wilderness before he was ready to lead people.
Veliki apostol Pavle,
The great apostle Paul,
kad je susreo Isusa na putu,
when he met with Jesus on the road to Damascus.
znate šta kaže Biblija? Da je proveo jedno vreme u Arabiji.
3 godine. Yeah. The Bible says that he spent some time in Arabia.
Šta je radio u Arabiji 3 godine?
What was he doing in Arabia for 3 years?
Znate, to je bila priprema.
That was his preparation.
On je razmišljao o sebi, o farisejstvu.
He was thinking about himself, about the Pharisees.
Čitao je Bibliju gde se Isus spominje u Starom Zavetu.
He was reading scriptures to see where was Jesus mentioned in the Old Testament.
Sad znate, nismo mi apostol Pavle,
Now, okay, we're not Apostle Paul.
nismo mi Mojsije,
We're not Moses.
ali mi moramo imati naše pustinje.
but we have to have our wilderness experience.
Jer vidite, to povlačenje nama pomaže u pripremi za velika dela.
Because it's this withdrawing that prepares us for great things.
Što je neko rekao za Mojsija.
Somebody said about Moses,
Mojsije je dobio obrazovanje na faraonovom dvoru, ali mudrost i karakter je formiran u pustinji.
Moses received education in Pharaoh's palace, but his wisdom and character were formed in the wilderness.
Šta je tvoja pustinja?
What is your wilderness?
Gde je tvoja priprema?
Where is your preparation?
Znate, Psalam 46 kaže, utolite i poznajte da sam ja Bog.
Psalm 46:10 says, "Be still and know that I am God."
Ako ikada ovaj stih bio važan, onda je u 21. veku.
If there was ever a time when this verse was important, it is in the 21st century.
Mi živimo u vreme buke,
We live in a time of noise,
u vreme zauzetosti.
a time of busyness.
Nemamo vremena za to tiho vreme sa Bogom.
We don't have time for this still quiet time with God.
Znate, možda danas mi ne činimo te velike stvari,
Maybe we don't do these great things today
jer imamo lošu pripremu i trening.
because we have poor training, poor preparation.
A znate, onda ja učim ovdje i kroz Mojsijev život.
And I learned here through the life of Moses,
Znate, ako nemam tu pustinju mog života, nekada me Bog može naterati.
if I don't have this wilderness experience that Moses had, God maybe has to force me.
Pa ni Mojsije nije želeo da ode u pustinju,
Well, Moses did not want to go in the wilderness either. He didn't do it joyfully,
ali ga je Bog poslao na trening.
but God sent him there for training.
A nekada u našem životu, znate, nekada Bog učini nešto da bi se povukao.
And sometimes God may act in the same way in our lives so that we could withdraw as well.
Ja sam toliko puta slušao, verujem i vi.
I've heard many times, and I'm sure you have as well.
Znate kad se ljudi približe Bogu?
Do you know when people get closer to God?
Kad izgube posao.
When they lose a job?
Zašto se približe Bogu?
Why do they get closer to God then?
Podjedno imaš vremena da razmišljaš.
All of a sudden you have time to think.
Ja sam slušao puno iskustava da ljudi kad izgube zdravlje nešto se dogodi.
I've also heard many experiences that something happens when people lose their health.
To nekada postane pustinja u njihovom životu.
It becomes a moment of wilderness in their lives.
Imaju vremena da razmišljaju.
They have time to think.
Na bolesničkoj postelji, u bolnici.
When you're lying in bed, maybe in the hospital.
I kaže, ljudi kad ozdrave, neverovatno ih to približi Bogu.
And people say that when they get better, it brings them incredibly close to God.
A znate šta je bilo interesantno, evo, COVID je iza nas.
When we think about COVID,
Kad uzmete statistike,
it's very interesting when you look at the
u
statistics.
toku COVID-a ljudi su se mnogo više zanimali za Boga nego, evo sada, post-COVID periodu.
People were concerned with God a lot more during COVID than since then.
Kažu, samo na internetu se više googlalo reči.
It says that on the internet, the Google searches for
Molitva,
prayer,
Bog,
God,
Biblija,
Bible,
nada, kako se moliti, i
hope,
tako dalje.
how to pray, and so forth.
Završio se COVID,
COVID ended.
mi krenuli u život
We've resumed life.
i nije to više toliko važno.
It's not so important anymore.
Vidite, nekad Bog može koristiti da nas dovede u pustinju, da razmišljamo više o njemu.
Sometimes God can use that wilderness experience to bring us closer to Him so that we think more about Him.
Ajde, ovdje ćemo završiti, ali koje su 4 pouke iz Mojsijevog života?
Let's finish here, but again, what are the 4 key factors in Moses' life?
Znati ko smo, naš identitet,
To know who we are, our identity,
ne šta ovaj svet kaže, nego šta Bog kaže.
not what the world says about us, but what God says about us.
Budimo spremni na patnju, kratku, za dugoročno zadovoljstvo.
Be ready for some short-term pain for long-term gain.
I imamo platu,
We have a reward.
to su naše vrednosti,
Those are our values.
ne ono što svet kaže,
Not what the world says.
ne ova 3P,
Not the 3 P's,
nego ono što Bog kaže.
but what God says.
I nemojmo zaboraviti utoliti i poznati ko je Bog.
And let us not forget to pull out a little bit and know and get to know God.
Kaže da jedna, pošto više vrsta bambusa postoji,
It is said that since there are many species of bamboo,
a jedna vrsta bambusa kada zalivate dugo,
there's one species of bamboo that when you water it a lot,
ništa se ne pojavljuje iznad zemlje.
nothing comes out of the ground.
I vi mislite ništa ne vredi.
And you're thinking this is useless.
Ali znate šta radi ovaj bambus?
But you know what this bamboo is doing?
Prvih nekoliko mjeseci on pušta samo korenje.
For the first few months, it just spreads its roots.
I onda kad su koreni jako duboko, tada počne da izlazi.
And then finally, when the roots have gone really deep, then it starts to germinate.
A kaže nekada 1 metar za 1 dan raste.
And then it said that it can grow 1 meter in a single day,
a ne može ništa da ga obori.
and nothing can stop it.
A onda Bog kaže, naše korenje treba da su takvi, duboki.
God says that our roots also need to be that deep.
A onda svi vetrovi ovoga sveta ne mogu nas oboriti.
And then all the storms in life cannot harm us.
A onda idemo ka tom najvećem zadovoljstvu,
And then we're going towards that greatest reward,
a to je večni život.
and that is eternal life.
I znate, i ovaj kratki bol na ovoj zemlji,
And so that short-term pain on earth,
šta je to naspram triliona i triliona godina?
what is that in comparison with trillions of years?
Koliki je to short term?
How short-term is that?
A Bog kaže, budi spreman na to.
So God says, be prepared for this.
Ili ja ti pripremam nešto mnogo slavnije.
I'm preparing something far greater for you.
Amin.
Amen.